Hi, Tim. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Bruce. Happy to be here.
Is it true that we've been working together since like 1981 or 82, more or less, continuously?
More or less. It's best not to count all the years, yeah.
And you're Senior Vice President at Synapse.
Yes, I am.
What have you been working on recently, and what are we talking about today?
Wow, I've been working on a lot of things recently, but almost all of them have to do with some form of benefit cost analysis, which I find fascinating because benefit cost analysis is at the heart of like almost every important decision made about utility investments and utility infrastructure. So that's been a lot of my work. And since you mentioned it, the National Centric Practice Manual was a big part of my work for quite a while. Just put it out in 2020. It provides a handbook for any issue that might come up regarding how you define your benefit cost test and how you do your analysis. Because it's so useful, we've found that it's taken off in so many different places. I think something like 25% of the states require this as a part of their, practices for looking into energy efficiency cost effectiveness or distributed energy resource cost effectiveness. And like another 60% or so the states are advocating for it, or it's being proposed by utilities and others. So it's really taken off.
What are the benefits of using this, systematic, comprehensive, detailed framework for benefit cost analysis?
For years and years, utilities and others used the California Standard Practice Manual for energy efficiency purposes. And then in more recent years, maybe the past 10 years or so, that's evolved into using the California Standard Practice Manual for distributed energy resources of all types. And the trouble with that is that the manual has been used incorrectly or misused or misinterpreted for so long. The whole impetus of the National Standard Practice Manual was to correct for anything that was not properly applied, not properly used, so that there was a one place to go for clear advice and guidance on how to do a sound benefit cost analysis. In doing this analysis and in the follow-up in the past 4 years, we've had a lot of people come to us and say, this is all great, but what about equity? Customer equity is of great interest to a lot of people. Many of you have probably heard about Justice 40, equity project from the Biden White House and the DOE, and many states now have legislation. And so we asked ourselves, well, what about equity? And the initial thinking was, well, it's another benefit that you could add to your list of benefits in your benefit cost test. And we quickly realized that it's just not that simple. It's much more complicated than that, and there's a whole lot more to it. So that inspired us to put together the guide we're talking about today on distributional equity analysis. And I should add, we got support for this guide from two places. The DOE, as you can tell by the cover on the slide here, the Department of Energy supported this, especially through the help of Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And then also E for the Future, who was one of the sources for the National Standard Practice Manual. They provided funding as well and worked closely with us. So the DEA guide was a collaboration of not just Synapse, but also LBNL, E for the Future. And we had a fairly large technical advisory group with people from all over the spectrum, people working on equity and so forth, to help put the whole report together.
Who should be using this guide, and what should they be doing?
The audience is like all regulators that are involved in utility decision-making, utility investment decision-making, any consumer advocates, environmental advocates, anybody interested in distributed energy resources. Because as I say, benefit cost analysis is kind of at the heart of that decision-making. So any of those parties should be interested. And then for the DEA guide, I would say the audience is even broader because a lot of additional people are interested in equity issues, whether they're environmental justice communities or the folks at DOE who are doing the energy justice program, anybody interested in equity that's related to utility investments.
So there's nowhere near enough time to really dive into the guide, but can you take us to a few key points?
Sure. So one of the first things we realized is that benefit cost analysis just isn't suited to look at distributional equity. That is, equity between different customer types. Because benefit cost analyses, when you think of it, the costs and the benefits that are included are averages across all customers on the system. And for equity, the key issue is separating out the typical customers from those that you're trying to protect for some reason, or those that you're trying to analyze for equity purposes. So we have a slide here where we show the differences between benefit cost analysis and DEA. And the first row there tells you, like, for benefit cost analysis, all the analysis and then the metrics, the outputs are all averages across all customers in the system. Whereas the key difference in distributional equity analysis is you separate out the customers into two groups. You could use more, but two is the simplest. And the two groups include what we call priority populations and other customers. And the priority populations is our term that is used to include terms you've probably heard: vulnerable customers, disadvantaged customers, environmental justice communities, anybody for whom equity is a concern. And that's what distinguishes DEA primarily, is that there's two groups you're looking at, not just one. So on the next row, you can see it's a similar theme where in the BCA, you just can't determine impacts differently across the two customer types. But for DEAs, there are specific metrics that are used to apply to the priority populations versus the general customers. And those metrics are kind of a second element to DEAs that distinguish them from BCAs. And the metrics are different. So in the third row, you can see that, BCAs focus mostly on monetary results. And so the metrics there are costs, benefits, net benefits, and benefit cost ratios. Those are your metrics. And people who are listening probably are familiar with those. They're standard practice. With DEA, there's a whole additional set of metrics that can be used that allow for assessment of equity. And this might include things like, how much do people's rates go up? How much do people participate in the programs? What are the health impacts of the programs? What are the environmental impacts? Will the DERs affect reliability? Will the DERs affect shutoffs and disconnections for customers? There's a whole long list of items that are of interest regarding equity that might be affected by the distributed energy resources being considered that can be looked at in a DEA that you can't look at in a BCA. And as I mentioned on the bottom row here, for BCA, you really should not look at rate bill impacts because it sort of muddies up the results. It's not a good way to look at it. However, when you're looking at a distributional equity analysis, you can do that because you've got separate analyses to tease out the differences.
It seems like with benefit cost analysis, it's almost like a no-go decision, right? You invest or don't invest, or do the program or don't. It seems like with distributional equity analysis, things are more complicated in terms of multiple objectives and considerations.
Yes, it's a much more nuanced and more sort of robust analysis with more things to consider. So it's not an easy go, no go decision. I think it might help if I show on the next slide the different steps that are necessary for conducting a DEA. And what you're getting at is the step 7 here, which I'll get to. So this is kind of core. This is an outline of what we provide in the guide. All these different steps are necessary to do a good DEA. The first step is the stakeholder process. You got to have good input because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of nuances here. And the stakeholder process has to include those people and organizations who represent the priority populations that you want to look at. So that's very important. And you can see at the bottom of this slide, stakeholder engagement needs to be a big part of the entire process. It's not something you set up once. It's something you do throughout. The second step is articulating the context. And by that, we mean the DEA needs to be parallel to the BCA. That is, you got to decide whether it's retrospective or prospective. You got to decide whether you're looking at one energy efficiency portfolio or you're looking at multiple portfolios. There's a variety of different combinations of DERs that you might look at in the BCA, and you need to use the same combinations in your DEA. Now, 3 and 4 are following up on what I said earlier. You got to identify your priority population. And while it might seem easy, there's actually a lot to that. There's a lot of ways that we can do it, different types of customers that you might include in there. So that's a key step. And then your metrics, I already mentioned, there's a long list of those that might potentially be useful in your DEA. You don't want to include everything under the sun because it becomes too burdensome and some aren't even relevant, but you want to have a good, robust set. And then the tricky part is applying the metrics to the party population. So, for example, if your metric is participation rate, one of my favorite metrics, you've got to figure out, okay, what portion of the party population participates in this program versus in the other customers, how they participate, that kind of thing. And the trick there is the data. There's a lot of mapping tools available that can be used to map the information from utilities on customers and participation rates to the priority population demographic data, but it takes a bit of time, and there's some challenges in making sure you get reasonable resolution. Once you've done that, then basically you present and interpret the DEA results. And there are different ways of doing that too. You can keep it fairly simple. You can make it a little bit more interesting and add in benchmarks for each metric. And that way you have some context for deciding whether equity is improved or worsened, or whether it's meeting your equity goals. And then the key step is the final one here, step 7, where you look at both your DEA and your benefit cost analysis, and then you make some decisions. And it would be really nice if this were an easy, you get a score or a number and it's a go or a no-go, but we don't live in such a simple world. And so basically you need to consider all of the metrics that come out of the BCA and the DEA. And in some cases, you might have a very clear decision where a program, let's just say an energy efficiency portfolio, it looks great in the benefit cost analysis and it looks great in the DEA, in which case, great, everything's fine. Or alternatively, it fails on both, and that's, obvious too. I think the trick is in most cases, you'll see that either a program or a portfolio will pass one and fail another. And that's where you have to kind of sit down and think through, well, what does this mean? Do we reject the program? Do we push it forward? Do we change the program? And I think a lot of times I'm hoping that this will lead to changing programs in a way that make them more equitable so that it passes both the BCA and the DEA. That's what we're trying to do here, is make sure that as we design these programs, they're as equitable as they can be while also being cost effective.
So it seems like that box 7 in the timeline can also involve some cycling back and making adjustments. It's not strictly a linear process.
Exactly, especially when you get to programs and portfolios where it's not clear that they're passing both kinds of tests. There is one more point that I should make. The DEA guide, and you can tell by this 7-step process on the slide, can be fairly resource intensive and demanding and expensive to do it as well as one should. If you're in a state or in a docket where you don't have all the resources and time that you would like to have, there are ways to streamline the process. And I encourage people to look in the report. We have a short section describing how to do that. I don't want people to get turned off by the concern that, wow, this is too much work for us, because even just doing a streamlined version of fairly simple steps can take you a long way towards understanding equity better. And eventually, you can take more and more steps over time as the resource and the interest become available.
Do you have any examples of this framework being put to use?
We dug into this, at the beginning of this project and found that no one is doing this yet. And we did a little more research and found that this concept of doing a distributional equity analysis is in use in practice. The EPA does it in some of its analyses for regulatory decision making. So it's not like we're inventing this out of whole cloth, but at the same time, it is not used anywhere to our knowledge in the electric or gas utility industries. We are now doing a project for a case study to show how this can work in Illinois, and that's going very well. We expect to have a study done in, I think, the second quarter of 2025. So this is kind of cutting edge. I will say that there are several states that are doing a lot of great work on equity. And I know that's happening in Washington State, in New York, in Massachusetts, and several other states. But we refer to those as like system-wide equity analyses. They're looking broadly, they're looking at many issues, and that's all great. But what this guide focuses on is the narrow question of, if you're going to make an investment in a distributed energy resource, is it going to improve equity? Is it going to worsen equity? Or can it be redesigned to improve equity? which is it's much narrower than what anyone has done before.
So maybe in some of like a general docket to focus on equity in utility planning, decision making, the one of the outcomes could be to apply tools like this in decision making.
Exactly. And I should note, this is really important. We focused our report on distributed energy resources because that's what a lot of people are looking at now. They're doing benefit cost analyses of it. And that's what the National Centric Practice Manual was focused on. So we have this proposed, these 7 steps you can see on the slide for how to do a DEA, built upon, what's already been done in other places. And it's focused on DERs. But this practice should be done for all utility investments. In fact, DERs are more a solution to equity concerns than they are a problem. So these kind of analyses should be done for new power plants, transmission lines, distribution infrastructure. In fact, it's more important to do them there because those create more equity concerns than they solve. So I hope that people don't walk away thinking that this is just for DERs. In fact, it's almost the opposite. It really should be done for all utility investments, especially the big ones in terms of dollars and the big ones in terms of equity impacts.
So what's next for you and the NSPM effort and the distributional equity analysis?
Well, as I mentioned, we've got a case study underway in Illinois. This DEA guide only came out, I think, in June or July. And we've already got some work to follow up on it in a couple of states and to provide on the ground kind of guidance to follow through. And I think we'll see more of that as we go. So I see this as an important trend that we'll be getting lots of work on because it's highly valued in a lot of places.
So anyone watching this who's interested in kind of learning more and how to apply it to their situation and the issues they're dealing with, they should download and read the report. But what else could they do? Where else could they look for more information?
I recommend people look to Justice 40, the DOE practice. And if they're looking at specific states, like I said, Washington State has a lot of good work. Illinois has a lot of good work. New York.
Thanks for being on the show, Tim. It's great talking with you.
My pleasure.